But let's just get into this really quick. The first question I said is about dinosaurs. It's for you, Pastor Kendu. My first question that we received on Instagram was, did dinosaurs exist? And if so, are they mentioned in the Bible?
Okay. Well, that's a good question. You don't get that one all the time. Did dinosaurs exist? Well, if you watched Jurassic Park, they did. And I think the answer, obviously, from the fossil record is yes, they did exist. They did walk on the earth at some time. Now, whether they were here with mankind is another debate and another question. I'm persuaded that they preceded man by many thousands of years, if not millions of years. But they definitely walked on the earth. And I think the Bible talks about, in Job, Leviathan. And if you read Job's account of this creature, it sounded pretty much like one of these ocean-going dinosaurs that we actually have fossil records of. And so many scholars and Bible critics do believe that that could be referring to an actual dinosaur that Job was talking about.
Awesome. I think, I don't know. That's smarter than I don't know. Okay, cool, sweet, dinosaurs. Okay, so the next one is for you, Dr. Michael Behe. And this one is what is the difference between intelligent design and creationism?
Okay, that's a good question, and most people, or many people, confuse the two. But in my mind, intelligent design starts from observations, physical evidence in the world, and says, what's the best explanation for this? So you start with, say, the bacterial flagellum, just to pick something, and say, well, what's the best evidence, or what's the best explanation for this? In my thinking, creation and creationism, creation is a theological concept. It is, and it's based on Scripture. Okay, I think we all agree. So it takes its start from scriptural accounts, and it takes the Word, it places its faith in those accounts. So it starts from a religious authority. I see the difference between intelligent design and creationism as similar to, say, the first chapter of Genesis compared to, say, the Big Bang Theory. Now, in both, they say that the world had a beginning. The world was not eternal, as many scientists and folks thought 100 years or so ago. But Genesis says that God revealed this to the author of Genesis. On the other hand, the Big Bang, people forget that before 100 or so years ago, most physicists thought that the universe was eternal and unchanging. And then the motions of galaxies away from each other was seen, and it looked like the aftermath of a big explosion. And so science came around to thinking that the universe had a beginning, but it was from observational data rather than a religious source. So I view intelligent design in the same way.
Thank you so much. Pastor Du, this is the next question is for you. How do we explain fate and prophecy versus free will? For example, how did Judas have free will if Jesus knew he would betray him?
Very good question. So it appears that if you are free agents, how can God know what you're going to do if you really are free to choose? Or are we just kind of robots or automatons, and we're predestined or we're programmed to go a certain way? And really, the Scripture says we are free, that God has given us a choice. And we see that in the garden where Adam and Eve chose to eat of the forbidden fruit. Now, the way you explain it is this way. It's very much like, how many like football? Anybody here a football fan? Let's say you were going to watch the Super Bowl. It was on Sunday. But because you were in church like a good Christian, you didn't stay at home and watch the Super Bowl. But a good Christian, if you were a good Christian, you'd be in church. But you've got a recorder, so you can record the entire game. Now, I stayed home and watched the game, and I saw who won and what the score was. But I didn't tell you about it, but you went home and you had your recording. And so what happens is you watch the game after the fact, you watch the entire game, and then you see the score 2 hours after the game had been played, and you think, my team lost or my team won. The real reality is the truth of what happened had already taken place, and even though I saw it, because God is outside of time, he knew the beginning from the end. He knew what the score would be, but the players still had to play the game, and you still had to watch it, and it was free will, yet God's providence already knew outside of time the beginning from the end. That's why we call him the Alpha and the Omega. He has foreknowledge of the way this thing's going to wrap up, but in his foreknowledge, he does not interfere with our free choice.
So good, yeah. Okay, Dr. Behe, this one's for you. I've heard before that experiments have actually proved evolution. How would you respond to that? How would you respond to somebody saying that experiments have proven evolution?
Okay, that's a good question. Yes, a lot of scientists do experiments on evolution, and I discuss some of them in my books. But for the longest time, people said, well, we can't really test it too well, evolution, because it takes a long time, and who has the time or the grant money to keep elephants around for a couple thousand years, millions of years, and so on. So people, but then in the late 1990s, scientists got the idea of using bacteria and microorganisms in evolutionary experiments, and the idea was to grow them and see what happened. And it turns out that a little bottle of broth can contain hundreds of millions of little bugs, little E. coli or bacteria. And there's a guy in particular, a guy named Richard Lenski at Michigan State, who did that. And he would grow bacteria for a day in a flask, and they replicate so fast, every 20 minutes or so, that the next day they would have eaten all the nutrients in the flask. And so he came in the next morning, took a little bit of those out, and put it in a fresh flask with fresh food. And they'd grow for a day, and he'd take it again and transfer it again and again and again. And they would go through 6 or 7 generations a day, and that adds up over time. And last I looked, they were up to 70,000 generations of bacteria. And it turns out, like I kind of referred to a little bit in my talk, he saw that they improved, that they grew faster, and that the latest evolved bacteria could grow almost twice as fast as the original starting bacteria. But again, in the past 2 decades, science has developed techniques to look at the molecular level, which is where the rubber meets the road in evolution. So he was able to tell exactly what was happening to the genes in that bacteria. And the first one he discovered was in a gene, an operon for something called for the ribose operon, helps make the sugar ribose. And they could see that the ribose operon was destroyed, that another piece of DNA had inserted itself in there and obliterated its ability to make the machinery for metabolizing ribose. And the next one was in another gene And that mutation destroyed that gene too. And there was another mutation which turned off the bacteria's ability to make a flagellum. The bacteria make fine flagella, but in his laboratory, the culture was rotated, stirred by machine, and it didn't have to swim. The bugs didn't have to swim. So why spend all that energy building it when you could use it to reproduce faster? And so they dispensed with flagella. And a couple of years ago, he published the definitive work on 50,000 generations of E. coli. And the top 30 genes that helped the bacteria survive or grow faster were all ones that were either totally broken or degraded from what they did in the past. So yes, evolution does happen, and it can be important too, medically important, like in antibiotic resistance, but it's just kind of fiddling around the edges of organisms, or it's kind of actively throwing things away in desperate circumstances.
Awesome. Thank you. Great answer. Yeah, that's... Pastor Dew, this one's for you. And this one actually is from myself. Is carbon... I was like, I'm doing this, I'm throwing in my own. Is carbon dating accurate? Is carbon dating accurate?
Well, it's called C14 carbon dating for those who aren't familiar with it. And I'm not an expert on this, but I have read up on it a little bit, and I would prefer to defer this to Dr. Behe, but he said he won't take it, so I'm gonna try and answer it. C14 carbon dating happens with organic living things. We're all made of carbon-12 and carbon-14. C14 it breaks down, it decays easily in organic beings or animals. And so if you were to take an animal and it died, and you take the carcass, there's something called half-life in C14, and that's about 5,700 years, 5,730 years, that after 5,730 years, the 100% of C14 found in the carcass would now be 50%. And so that's how they can measure how old a carcass is, by the absence of C14. Now, it's accurate if the rate of decay of the carcass in the C14 is constant over those 5,700 years, and if when the animal was alive, it had 100% of C14 in its carcass. And so if there's not 100%, you're assuming there's 100%. So if there's 90%, you're going to have an inconsistent reading, and it's going to appear younger than it actually is. So there's two criteria. Number one is if the rate of decay stays the same over the testing period. If that happened, 5,700, if it stayed the same, then yes, it's an accurate reading. And they've already found that there's something called leaching, where there's water or certain chemicals that can actually cause the sample to lose C14 quicker than the half-life. And the other thing is that you're assuming it had 100% of C14 when it died. A case in point, they did a study on the West Coast, I think it was San Diego. They found a dead seal on the beach. This biologist took it and he froze it for 35 years, then brought it out of deep freeze, and they did the C14 testing on it. It dated to be 20,000 years old, yet it was only 35 years old. He knew this. So it's accurate if the rate of decay is the same and if there's 100% C14 to begin with when the animal died.
I told you, Camille. I told you. I told you. Now I have pastor and a scientist on my side. Here we go. Here we go. Just joking. Okay, Dr. Behe, this is for you. Elon Musk pretty recently said that we most probably are living in a simulation. How would you respond to Elon Musk saying that?
I would say that's pathetic. You know, I mean, how can you respond when somebody who is clearly intelligent undercuts the very basis of rationality? You cannot, if you have an argument that says that rationality does not exist, you are refuting your own ability to make an argument. Good. How can he make an argument if he thinks everything is a simulation? This got started in 2000 when there was a philosopher named Nick Bostrom who proposed that, well, gee, the universe looks real designed. So there's two possible explanations, either design or there's a multiverse. And he says, well, let's not talk about design. So he went on to spend his book talking about the multiverse, and then he said, hey, what if somebody in that multiverse developed a big computer and could run simulations, and why the simulations would outnumber the physical universes, and the probability would be that we lived in that. Yeah. And you gotta be crazy. I mean, crazy. But that's what happens when you deny your own mind. Right. You go off the rails. And a couple years ago, that's just given to you like it is. A couple years ago, the American Museum of Natural History in New York City sponsored a conference on the question, are we living in a computer simulation? And in it were top-notch scientists and top-notch philosophers. And what's his name? The kind of television astrophysicist. What's his name? Neil deGrasse Tyson. Yeah, good. Neil deGrasse Tyson, kind of the face of science for many people, said, yeah, I think it's pretty likely that we're living in a computer simulation. Not only is that, self-refuting and astonishingly ignorant, but think of the impact that, a public figure like that representing science to, say, young people, what sort of impact is he going to have? Kid, I'm not real anyway. What does it matter what I do? Right. So yeah, it's pathetic, but it's all part of the pathology of trying to explain everything, including our ability to reason, our minds, by physical processes.
Wow, that was so good. Thank you. We're coming for you, Elon. We're coming. Okay, so this one is for Pastor Kendu. What would you say to women who may discount the Bible based off of the lack of representation of women in terms of the value and importance of their role in Christianity/society?
My first thing would say, come meet my wife, and you would see that things have changed, which is wonderful. Most people have to remember that the Bible is not prescriptive in some of its stories. It's descriptive. It's not telling you what should happen or ought to happen. It's telling you what actually did happen. Now, there's no question about it that ancient Near East cultures viewed women a little above children, and in some cases to the equal of children, and they were seen as personal property, and there was abuses and neglect and all the things that we would all say is not right. And it was Jesus who actually gave credibility and elevated the status of women. In fact, Jesus was discovered from the tomb by 3 women. That was an anathema in his age. Now, why did God allow that? Why did God allow those things to happen? Why is it that when Jesus was on the cross, he spoke to John, the disciple and said, that woman there, Mary, who was weeping and crying, take care of her. That was way out of character for the customs of that time. Now you got to realize, during that time in the Roman, Greco-Roman world, in the Greek world that preceded the Roman, occupation of Palestine, women were chattel. In fact, women could be sold. Women could not vote. Their testimony in court was dismantled. This was by the Greek culture. A woman, if she was raped or found in a compromising situation, her husband could have her sold or could divorce her and take the children. If a woman owned property, that property would automatically go to the husband. This is in the Greco-Roman world. And so when you see things written in Scripture, these are not prescriptive. They are descriptive of what happened, because much of the Bible, 80% of the Bible, is a historical narrative. It's telling you what took place. It's not validating it or giving license to it. In fact, it was Jesus that said, or Paul the Apostle, who said about women, there's neither Greek nor Jew. There's neither slave nor free. Galatians chapter 3, verse 28. There's neither male nor female. You all have the same value in God's eyes.
So good. That's so good. Thank you. This is the very last question that we have, and it's for you, Dr. Behe. I have to find it. I'm sorry. I'm not a professor. It's just okay. So here's the last question. Is that it's how did God design life? How did God design life?
Okay, that's an easy one. And the short answer is I haven't the foggiest idea. And a slightly longer explanation is that the great thing about intelligent design, a conclusion of design, is that we don't have to know how an intelligent mind did something. We don't have to know its history or the mechanism of its construction. All we have to do is look at it right now, and we know that something was designed. If you think of Mount Rushmore, suppose, somebody told you that, it was drilled by lasers from spaceships, 300 years ago. Well, you can't tell from just looking at it whether or not that's true. You have to do more investigation. But you darn sure know it wasn't the wind and erosion and so on. You know it was purposefully designed. The same thing with anything else. That Jungle Trap. Remember the Far Side cartoon, the Jungle Trap, where the lead explorer was strung up and so on. Suppose I told you, that's not a jungle. That turns out it's on an alien planet. And it's those aren't jungle explorers, they're actually space explorers. Now you ask, who built that trap? And how? And so on. Now, you don't know. I don't know. You'd have to do a whole lot more investigation, and you might never be able to figure it out. But just by looking at it right now, the way it's arranged, you can know for certain that it was indeed purposefully done. So the question is, we don't have to know how God created life or designed life or even much about the history of life. But we sure as heck can know, just by looking how fearfully and wonderfully made we are, that in fact we were intentionally made.
So good. So good. So good. Did you guys have fun tonight? Come on, can you give them another round of applause, our amazing speakers?